What's up, guys? It's Hunter Sitchy from CheckShotPoker.com, and the title of today's video is 2-5 at the Hard Rock. So, as you all know, I play full time in South Florida, and my primary casino is the Hard Rock in Hollywood, Florida. A lot of the bigger games have died down recently, and they tend to do that just before the WSOP. So, lately I've had no choice but to play mostly 2-5 at the Hard Rock. Luckily for you guys, I've gotten myself into some hands that are worth discussing, and I'm going to share them with you today. So, without further explanation, let's just jump into them. So, in this first hand, I'm dealt Ace King in the big blind. EP1 is a middle aged guy that I don't have a lot of info on. He ends up opening to 30. It folds around to the button who flats. Small blind folds, and it's back to me in the big blind. I'm left to make a decision. So, when I'm playing against someone that I don't have info on and he opens to 6x under the gun in a 9-handed game, I'm going to assume that he's playing a tight range of hands. Because of that, I don't think I can 3-bet for value in this situation, and I think that narrows my range of options to calling or folding. I definitely think Ace King is too strong to fold in this spot, so I end up calling, and we go three ways to the flop of 5 of diamonds, 4 of diamonds, deuce of clubs. I check, EP1 bets 60, the button folds and gets out of the way, and it's back to me. I think this hand is a decent candidate for check raising because I have the backdoor diamond draw, a gut shot, and 2 overs. But I also think it plays well as a check call because it's less expensive, and my ace high is often going to be good here, especially if my opponent is betting hands like ace queen or ace jack here. So I decide to check call. The turn is the king of spades, which I think is the best card in the deck for me. I check. EP1 bets 80 into 212. When he bets really small like this, I actually contemplated check raising for value. But the problem with that is I think my opponent might value bet a hand like queens, jacks, or tens on this board and try and go for thin value. And if I check raise, I probably end up losing a street of value that I could potentially get on the river. So I decided to just check call and play it as kind of a showdown value hand. The river is the 9 of hearts. I check again. EP1 bets half pot. This is the top of my range, and I don't have enough info to make a hero fold here. I end up calling, and EP1 has King Jack. So I'm showing you this situation to kind of illustrate how to take a mental note after a hand here. So first of all, keep in mind that he opened to 6x under the gun with King Jack here. So had I known that, I certainly would have 3-bet preflop for value. And in the future, I would probably add a lot of bluffs to my range as well. If he's really opening that wide, I think I can probably punish him in a couple squeeze situations later on. Also, it's important to note that he was betting complete error on this board. He had no backdoor flush draw or gut shot potential here. And then the third thing to note is that he bet quite a bit smaller when he actually paired up on the turn. So all of those inconsistencies combined will allow me to kind of exploit this guy in the future. And that's why it's really important to pay attention, especially at showdown in spots like this. Okay, so I think this second hand illustrates a lot of the pros and cons between over limping and isolating with a mediocre hand on the button. So it ends up folding around to the hijack who limps, the cutoff limps, and I'm on the button with ace 4 of spades. So I always tell my students, if you don't feel comfortable isolating the $30 and going to work post flop, I'm totally fine with you over limping on the button and trying to flop top pair, 2-pair, trips, the wheel, or the nut flush draw, and maneuver post flop in a smaller pot. The only problem with this is if the blinds are aggressive or intelligent, at some point they're going to start isolating really big to like $35 or $40, and you're most likely going to have to limp fold because your range is so capped. So if you decide to limp call against an isolation like that, a lot of times you're going to end up getting owned post flop because the blinds can represent hands that you can't represent since your range is capped. Okay? If the blinds aren't aggressive or intelligent, limping is totally fine. But by the same token, I'd like you guys to start getting better post flop and start experimenting with thinner spots like this and just try to isolate to $30 and see what happens. Build up that confidence post flop so you can start generating a higher win rate. So I end up isolating to 30. The small blind and the big blind fold. So this is another great thing that happens when you start isolating in position. You get to buy up the equity of the small blind and the big blind and also create some dead money in the pot for yourself. And at the same time, you can represent stronger hands post flop, obviously. So the hijack and the cutoff end up limp calling, and we go three ways to the flop of Jack 5 deuce with one spade. They both check to me. Now, as you've seen in my other videos, I think this is a mandatory c-bet. I can represent stronger hands than they can represent, and there are a ton of turn cards that I can continue to fire on. So an ace probably improves me to the best hand. A 3 gives me close to the nuts. And any of the 10 spades in the deck allow me to keep firing. Any of the 11 hearts in the deck also allow me to continue representing a hand that the cutoff and the hijack most likely cannot represent as much as I can. So I fire 75. Unfortunately, the hijack and the cutoff end up check calling. Luckily for me, the 8 of spades comes off. They both check to me. And here's something where I do something that's a little bit unorthodox. I decide to overbet shove here. Now, before you say that this is just crazy, hear me out. This is a spot where I'm isolating with hands like aces, kings, queens, ace, jack, jacks, fives, deuces, and c-betting with all of them on the flop. And it's also a spot where I would likely overbet the turn with all of those hands because there are so many bad rivers that can come off and kill my action and prevent me from getting stacks in. So a heart comes off. It's difficult for me to value bet top set. Spades come off. It's going to be difficult for me to value bet ace jack. An overcard comes off. It becomes difficult for me to value bet aces. Because of that, I'd like to ship the turn and give myself a chance to get stacks in before all of those bad cards come off. But in order to balance for that, I need to occasionally be overbet shoving with nut heart draws or nut spade draws. And I think that this is a great spot to do it because put yourself in the position of the hijack or the cutoff. Even if you have a hand as strong as queen jack or even king jack, how comfortable do you feel calling off 100 big blinds against a guy that has represented strength the entire hand and is now overbetting into two people? You likely don't feel very comfortable. And then consider all of the other hands that they can have. They can have tens through pocket threes. They can have all of the worst heart draws where the board might break out and I have the best hand with ace high. They can have 5-4 and 6-5 and random hands like 3-4. There are so many different hands that I can continue to fire with here that I feel like it would just be criminal to not overbet, especially since I'm also doing that with value hands here. And luckily for me, the hijack and cutoff end up folding, but I just wanted to describe this situation and show you how much thought is really going into it when I do something seemingly crazy like this. Alright, so I think this next hand has a lot of the same features as the last hand with a few key differences. So first of all, there's a button straddle involved. For those of you who aren't familiar with the button straddle or the Mississippi straddle, or maybe you don't play live poker, a lot of casinos in South Florida allow you to straddle from any position, and then the action just starts to your left. So in this case, the action starts in the small blind. The small blind ends up folding, the big blind completes. EP1 also calls along with MP. Hijack folds and it's four-way to me. So one thing that you need to know about straddling, especially straddling on the button, is that it can be a very profitable play, but only if you're playing against a very passive table. So you're relying on your opponents limping too much, and allowing you to realize equity with all the bad hands that you're going to be dealt on the button. So if you can recover your share of the pot, so in this case, let's say that I fold, can the button recover his 1/4 of the pot with all of the bad hands that he's going to be dealt on the button? If so, it's a great play because the rest of the time, when he actually is dealt a good hand, he can isolate and get twice as much value as he normally would. Okay, the spot where all of that falls apart is when somebody really good is in the hijack or the cutoff, and they're going to be raising all of these limpers that are limping with unprotected ranges and punishing you because you're going to have too many hands in your range and you're not going to be able to defend with all of them effectively. Okay, so this is something that the button did not take into account. If I'm sitting to his right, he should never be straddling the button. Okay, so anyway, leading up to my point, this is almost the exact same situation as the other hand. It's okay to limp with a7 suited in this spot, especially if the button isn't an aggressive player. Okay, but I would like to you to challenge yourselves to start isolating a little bit thinner against players that aren't going to try and limp raise you with big hands here. So this is a spot where I frequently isolate to something like $75. The button ends up folding because he has to play 100% of hands. And EP1 ends up limp calling. We go heads up to a flop of 10-8-6 with 1 heart, very similar to the last flop. EP1 checks, and again, I bet 125 for a variety of reasons. Again, there are 10 hearts left in the deck that I can keep firing with. There are 11 clubs in the deck that I can fire with. I have a gut shot to the second nuts. An ace often improves me to the best hand, and if an offsuit king, queen, or jack comes off, it changes the structure of the board and weakens the overall strength of EP1's range. Because of all of that, I c-bet. EP1 ends up check calling, and the turn is the 5 of clubs. So here's a card that is seemingly innocuous, but it's actually great for me. So EP1 checks, and I now pick up an open ender. Obviously, 2 of my outs aren't clean because they bring in a flush, but it gives me 3 extra outs to a straight. So if my opponent check calls this turn, he likely doesn't have a flush, and it makes those 3 outs good for me. At the same time, my ace is still good, and I can represent clubs because if EP1 had clubs, let's say he flopped a big club draw, he's likely going to be check raising with those. Okay, so I can represent more flushes than EP1 can. Because of all that, I can put a tremendous amount of pressure on him, especially when you consider that I still have $700 left. So that's a lot of leverage because in EP1's mind, he's thinking that on most rivers, he's going to have to put his whole stack in. So if he commits to calling the turn, he's likely going to have to follow through and call off the other 700. So there's a tremendous amount of leverage in this spot for myself. EP1 ends up folding. Later, he actually told me that he folded top 2. And again, that's just like another example of live players having no idea how to combat an aggressive strategy that I use in position like this. So here's another hand with ace-7 suited. It's a slightly different situation, but I think it brings up a lot of good points about leverage and bet sizing. So EP1 ends up opening to 20, and it folds around to the cutoff, who calls 20, and I'm on the button with ace-7 suited. So those of you who have watched my other videos know that I like to 3-bet light with hands like ace-deuce through ace-5 suited, especially against late position openers. That allows me to balance my range and play better post-flop. Don't make the mistake of 3-betting early position openers too often with ace-deuce through ace-5 suited. And at the same time, don't be afraid to add ace-6, ace-7, ace-8, ace-9 suited if people are folding way too often or if they're making mistakes post-flop. So the forcing function in this situation is that EP1 is opening too wide and folding too often. I had info on him from prior sessions. And the second half of the contingency is that the cutoff is flatting with a capped range, meaning that he would have 3-bet EP1 with all of his monster hands, like Queens Plus and Ace King. So I think the best hand that he could have in this situation would be something like tens or Ace Queen. Because of that, if he decides to flat after my 3-bet, I can represent stronger hands post flop than he can, and it's usually going to be a mistake for him to call, especially if EP1 folds. So for those reasons, I 3-bet to 85. EP1 folds as expected, and cutoff ends up calling. This is a mistake on his part. So the flop comes king 6-5 with 1 spade. Notice that the spade is a king. So on the rare occasions that a spade comes off on the turn, that's important because I know that my opponent can't have top pair with a flush draw. Because the king is a spade, it blocks out those combinations. That's important, and at the same time, I also have backdoor straight draw potential with an 8 or a 4, and I also have some gut shot potential as well. So cutoff ends up leading out for 55. This is a little bit unorthodox. This is a play that I don't want to see any of my students making. It's a very defensive play because if he had flopped top pair, there's no point for him to value bet because he's going to create more value by just allowing me to bluff. Okay, so if he's going to create more value by just allowing me to bluff, what does this bet mean? It's usually a defensive bet. He's trying to either get me to fold air in this situation, or he's trying to slow me down so that he can get to showdown cheaply. The vast majority of the time, I'd say like maybe 5% of people are intelligent enough to take this line with a really big hand and try and induce me to spaz. The rest of the players' pool is almost always doing this defensively. Because of that, I think it's important to raise to 160 in this spot and notice the sizing. If my opponent calls, the pot's going to be $517. And I'm going to have 355 left, so I can fire roughly a 65% turn shove if any of those good cards in the deck come off for me. And in saying that, this play gives me a tremendous amount of leverage. So cutoff ends up calling, and the turn is a Queen of Diamonds. It's one of the worst cards in the deck, and then cutoff leads for 100. So since I've been in this situation quite a bit, if somebody leads once and calls my bluff raise and then leads again, they almost always have a really big hand, and they're just trying to induce me to spaz out. So I would say that the most likely hand that my opponent has is like a set of 6s, set of 5s, or 6-5 suited. And stacks aren't really deep enough for me to try and set up like a river shove here or something. So I end up having to fold, but I was showing you this hand to illustrate leverage. So first of all, pre-flop, if somebody's opening too wide and folding too often and somebody's flatting with a capped range, attack that as much as possible. And if somebody is leading out with a weak range on flops like this, bluff raise, especially if you have a lot of good backdoor potential, and make sure that you raise to a size that allows you to set up a shove on a later street. All right, this is the last hand with A7 suited, I promise. I guess when I was looking through my hand histories for this week, I didn't really realize how many spots I was barreling really aggressively with a suited ace, but that's a big facet of my game, and I think it brings up a lot of good points on like backdoor equity and leverage. So anyway, in this hand, small blind folds, big blind ends up calling along with EP1. It ends up folding to me, so I've got 3 opponents instead of 4 like the last hand. I end up isolating to $60 for the same reasons as all the other hands. This time button ends up calling and big blind and EP1 get out of the way. So the biggest thing to be aware of going to the flop is that button called off about 20% of his stack here. So it's going to limit my options post flop. I'm probably going to have to make this a 2 straight hand. So king 8-5 with 1 heart. The king is a heart, so my opponent can't turn top pair with a flush draw. That's important. Also, I have some backdoor straight draw potential and an open ender if a 6 comes off. So all of that is pretty favorable for me, especially against a guy that has a little bit more incentive to call because he's in position and he already has $10 in there. He might over defend a little bit, and that might make his range a little bit weak. The only thing I really need to do is decide how I want to distribute my bets. So I can like overbet shove the flop. I could like check and see what happens and probably shove the turn. I could bet a normal size, but then it's going to be weird if I have to call off like $140 more with ace high. So I end up doing something that I think MTT players understand a lot better than cash game players. I bet about a third of the pot. I bet $45, and this bet functions very well for a variety of reasons. So I might get my opponent to fold complete air. If he doesn't, he's going to have to float quite a bit, and there are plenty of turn cards in the deck that I can fire with, and this bet size sets up a really good shove size for me on the turn. So a button ends up calling. The deuce of spades comes off, and that's one of the worst cards in the deck. I can't really do anything. I check, and button bets 75. I have to check fold. But I just wanted to show you how, first of all, you attack guys that straddle the button, especially when you're in the cutoff. You c-bet when you have a lot of backdoor potential, and you use the correct sizing so you can set up a turn shove in this spot. All right, here's a situation where I end up making a pretty big hero fold. So for those of you that know me, you know that I'm not making a lot of big laydowns, but the times that I do, I have a really good reason to be doing it, and I just wanted to share my reasoning in this hand. So the biggest thing to note is that I straddled the button here. Obviously, I didn't know that I was going to be dealt jacks pre-flop. The reason I decided to straddle the button was because this was a very passive table, and I felt like they were going to limp to me a lot instead of trying to steal my $10. And because of that, I felt like I could actualize a lot of my equity with all the poor hands that I'm dealt because I'm in position and people are limping to me. And the times that I have a really big hand, I'm going to be able to make twice as much value by isolating the times that they limp to me. So that's why I did that. It ends up folding all the way around to the cutoff, who raises to 30. So this is the situation that you're not trying to generate. You're trying to avoid this when you straddle the button. So maybe that was a mistake on my part. Maybe I had a poor read on the table, or maybe this was just kind of an anomaly at the table. Anyway, I look down and I'm happy to see that I have jacks. I 3-bet the button to 100 strictly for value. Jacks are way more of a value hand for me than for most players because I'm 3-betting so often with all these other suited aces and stuff. So people are forced to defend against me, and when I'm in position, it's going to be pretty tough to beat me. So cutoff ends up calling, and we go heads up to a flop of queen 10-4, 2 spades. Notice that I don't have the jack of spades in my hand. So cutoff checks to me, and I'm left to decide what to do. So this is a situation where I think you can go either way. I think you can bet the flop for thin value and probably end up checking back the turn and evaluating the river. I also think that you can check back the flop and kind of avoid a lot of check raises, and at the same time induce your opponent to stab the turn a little bit. So that's why I end up choosing the latter. I think it's just better to pot control. The turn is the 3 of clubs, cutoff checks, and then I think this makes jacks a really easy value bet, especially since I don't have the jack of spades in my hand. So now I can get called by weak 10s, I can get called by like 9s through 5s, or ace 3, ace 4, deuces, and I can also induce a lot of check raises from like straight flush draws and stuff, and I'm fine with that. I know how to defend against that. So all in all, I think it makes it a pretty easy value bet. I bet 125 and cutoff ends up calling. And then of course, since I have to make a hero fold in this hand, the Jack of Clubs comes off, and my opponent instantly bets $1,000. So this is a situation that is similar to a lot of the situations that my students bring up in our hand history review sessions. And like they always ask me the same question, like, what do you do when somebody just bombs the river in a tough spot like this? Uh, I have kind of a system of questions that I start asking myself if I don't immediately know what to do, especially when somebody takes an unorthodox line like this. So the first question I ask myself is my opponent poor enough that he could value bet a worse hand in this spot? So is this guy a bad enough player or a bad enough hand reader that he would ship the river with a hand like Queen Jack or Jack 10? I don't think so. I don't think he would bet that much money with just top two when there's so much straight potential on this board. Okay. Then the second question I ask myself is my opponent capable of bluffing for that much money? So there are a lot of people that are capable of bluffing in spots like this, but they're not capable of pulling the trigger for that much money. I think for like 2-5 players, the amount of money that most people are willing to bluff caps out around $100. Okay. Obviously, that number becomes uncapped as you start playing against really sick players like at 10 and a quarter. It gets to a point where they don't really care how much money they have to risk as long as it's a profitable play. Okay. But when you're playing against an average 2-5 player, I would say 99% of them are not capable of making a $1,000 bluff. Because of that, I think that it makes this situation a pretty easy fold, especially since there are two spades on the board. So it gives my opponent combinations of ace king that he could potentially check call the turn with. It gives him combinations of 9-8 or king 9 suited that he could check call the turn with if he decides to not check raise. All in all, I think that jacks is toward the top of my range, but my opponent has such a huge range advantage, and he's so unlikely to be bluffing in the spot that I actually have to end up folding the top of my range. I fold, and after agonizing for 20 to 30 seconds, luckily my opponent ends up showing me an offsuit ace king, so that made my day quite a bit better knowing that I made a good laydown here. But I just wanted to kind of illustrate the two questions that I ask myself right away when I get in a difficult spot like this. So that kind of wraps up the video today. I feel like I hammered home a lot of very important concepts. So especially pre-flop play, make sure you target people that open too wide and fold too often. Go ahead and add ace-6 through ace-9 suited to your normal 3-betting range and really exploit them. Target people that flat with capped ranges and know how to represent stronger hands post-flop. Target people that straddle the button when you're to their right. They should not ever be doing that. And at the same time, make sure that you target people that limp with capped ranges. If they're not intending to limp call a big isolation raise and they're not intending to limp raise you with monsters, you can pretty much attack them with impunity. And moving forward to the flop, make sure that you bet when you flop monsters. We play an aggressive style, so play for stacks the times that you have it. When you flop big equity, keep betting for the same reasons, balance it out. And when you flop big backdoor equity, keep firing and know which turn cards that you're going to fire on, because a lot of times you're going to pick up enough equity that your opponent only needs to fold 15 or 20% of the time on the turn, and they're almost always folding that often. So utilize an aggressive strategy. Poker is not about flopping sets. It's about utilizing pot equity and fold equity to your advantage, okay? And at the same time, when you get to river situations like this last hand and somebody takes an orthodox line, always ask yourself those two questions. Is my opponent bad enough to value bet a worse hand? If not, is my opponent capable of making a bluff that big. So when you look over at some middle-aged white guy that plays once or twice a week for 4 hours, is he really capable of making $1,000 bluff? No, not ever. And that allows you to make much bigger folds than normal and save yourself a significant amount of money just because you understand the psychology of the situation. So I hope you guys can put all of that together and learn how to apply it at the table and increase your win rates. Again, I'm Hunter Sitchy from CheckShowPoker.com. Make sure you run good, have fun, and constantly look for ways to improve.